Hello and welcome to the Legal Lens podcast. So, where we break down complex legal concepts in a clear and meaningful way. So, today's episode focuses on strict liability, a major thought principle rooted in the famous English case Rylance and Fletcher. So, how it affects Malaysians today. So, I'm joined by three fantastic panelists. Okay, so Tarifa,
Hi, my name is Sharifa. I'm the specialist in Malaysian tort law.
Harini,
So hi, I'm Harini. I'm a practicing lawyer in environmental and industrial liability cases.
Vaishnavi.
Hi, I'm Vaishnavi and I'm a law lecturer specializing in causation and possibility.
So here's how today discussion will flow goes like. So number one, strict liability. What is it? Its elements and Malaysian cases. So secondly, the future of strict liability. And the third, causations and rewardness, why they matter to us. And also number four, how these principles limit liability. And number five, the closing marks. So let's begin. So let's get
Started.
Okay, Tarifa, let's start simple. Could you explain me what strict liability actually means?
So, strict liability is a principle of tort law where a person or a company can be held responsible for a harm even if they're carefully with it. So, it applies when someone engages in an activity that is like inherent dangerous. So, for example, if a factory stores hazardous chemical and also one leak into the river, the factory can be liable regardless of the safety measures. So, this basically focuses on the risk of the activity itself, not whether a person was negligent or not.
Exactly. Strict liability is about danger posed by activity itself, not whether someone acted carelessly. For example, if a person keeps snake at home and one escape, they could be held liable even if all cages and safety precautions were properly in a place. The law treats risky activity differently because the potential for harm is very high. These principles ensure that anyone who chooses to engage in hazardous activities take full responsibility for any possible damage that may result.
So, in short, strict liability applies whenever someone voluntarily takes on high risk activity. For example, building a pond with a dam could be risky. If heavy rain causes the dam to overflow and flood a neighbor's land, the landowner could be liable even if the dam was properly built and maintained. Choosing the activity means accepting the risk of possible harm.
Harini, if someone wanted to bring a strict liability claim, what would they need to prove in court?
Check. There are generally four essential elements that must be established. First is the defendant brought or accumulated something on their land. The land was used in a non-natural or unusual way. The thing is brought onto the land was likely to cause harm if it's escaped. The thing is escaped and caused forcible damage.
Non-natural use of land is often the trickiest element, so court considered that the activity whether was unusual or extraordinary for the location. What may have been considered non-natural a century ago might be a common today.
Exactly, context matters. The type of activity, the environment, and the level of inherent danger all factor into whether the court considers the land use non-natural.
Now let's move on to the real world applications. Harini, could you start with the original English case that laid the foundation for strict liability?
Certainly, in Raylan versus Fletcher, the defendant Rylance constructed a large reservoir on his land. They were old and abandoned mine shafts beneath the property. When the reservoir was filled, water escaped through these hidden shafts and flooded Fletcher's neighboring coal mine, causing significant damage and financial loss. The case raised the important questions of whether Rylance could be held legally responsible even though he had not been negligent in constructing or maintaining the reservoir.
The central legal issue was whether the liability could arise solely from the escape of the dangerous thing, without any proof of carelessness or a fault. Maybe the part of Rylance. Essentially, could someone be held responsible for the consequences that were not the result of negligence, but were direct outcome of the hazardous activity?
This case ultimately established the principle of strict liability. The House of Lords held that Rylands was strictly liable for the damage caused by the escaped water. The court emphasized that if someone brings onto their land something likely to cause mischief, if it escapes, and it does escape, they were responsible for any foreseeable damage. Irrespective of how careful they were, this principle forms the basis of strict liability and has influenced many common law jurisdictions, including Malaysia.
To succeed under this rule, a plaintiff must establish several elements. First, that a thing was brought onto the land. Second, it was likely to cause harm if it is escaped. Third, that the land was used in a non-natural way. Fourth, that the dangerous thing actually escaped. And fifth, that escape caused forcible damage. This framework has guided court in assessing liability in similar cases worldwide.
Wind Team, the Pacific Team Consider Lake Corps, a large mining pond owned by the defendant collapsed by the following heavy rainfall. This released vast a quantity of water and mining waste onto the neighboring land, causing the significant flooding and the property. So the key question before the court was whether the company could be held liable even though it had exercised a reasonable care in maintaining the pond. Applying the principle of Lyon and Fletcher, if you can see, the court found that the storing such as a large volume of water constitute non-natural use of land. This also escaped the direct results of the activity and also resulting flooding, which was forcible. Even though the company had taken precautions, strict liability applied because the risk was inherent and the activity itself. So the court held defendants strict liable, demonstrating that the industrial hazard such as mining operation can trigger strict liability in Malaysia, reflecting the broader principle that high-risk activities carry on inherent responsibilities.
So the second case is Abdul Rahman bin Chinga versus Putih bin Samad in 1978. In this case, the defendant has spilled a large quantity of vegetation near the plaintiff's rubber estate and set it on fire. Unfortunately, the fire spread beyond control and destroyed the plaintiff's rubber trees. The legal question was whether the defendant could be held liable even though he did not intend for the fire to escape. Applying Rallis versus Fletcher case, the court recognized that fire is inherently dangerous and that peeling vegetation in such a way constitute non-natural use of land. The escape of the fire caused forcible damage to the neighboring estate. The court therefore held the defendant strictly liable. The case actually illustrates the strict liability in Malaysia is not limited to industrial or chemical hazards. It extends to other risky activities such as managing fire where the danger is obvious and the consequences of escape are forcible.
So in Mile Perusahaan Sdn Berhad versus Kembang Masyur Sdn Berhad, the case involved construction earthworks on higher ground. During the process, soil and debris from the defendant's land escaped downhill, causing damage to the plaintiff's lower lying property. The issue before the court was whether the moving large amount of soil in construction could give rise to strict liability if it escaped and caused harm. The court applied Rylands versus Fletcher principles and held that moving large volumes of soil constituted non-natural use of land and the damage caused by the escape was direct and foreseeable. Importantly, liability was imposed even though there was no evidence of negligence. This case shows that strict liability applies broadly in Malaysia. It is not limited to water or chemicals, but also extends to construction activities, earthwork, and other physical hazards where the risk is inherent and the consequences of escape are foreseeable.
Tarifa, what are the main limitations of debates surrounding the strict liability in Malaysia?
There are three main issues: definition of non-use natural, which is a vague and also subjective, leading to inconsistent application. Modern industrial hazards such as air pollution or chemical emotion, as you can see, may not escape in the traditional sense. In practice, court often prefer negligence claim, which are easier to prove and also more flexible.
Defenses include act of God, acts of strangers, consent to the plaintiff, or contributory negligence.
But an act of God must be truly extraordinary. For example, a flood that is entirely unpredictable, not just a heavy Malaysian rainstorm.
Harini, as Malaysia continues industrialize, is strict liability still relevant?
Absolutely. With more factories, chemical storage, logistic operation, and waste management, strict liability ensures that companies remain accountable for high-risk activities.
Industries such as oil and gas, construction are particularly exposed to the potential claim if the operation cause harm.
The public increasingly expects safety and accountability. Strict liability serves as a deterrent and ensures that those who take risk bear the consequences.
Vaishnavi, why are causations and remoteness important in determining liability?
Even if the actions are careless or inherently dangerous, a defendant is only liable if their conduct automatically caused the harm, if the harm was not too remote.
Actually, without these limits, liability could be fairly wide, holding someone accountable for outcomes they could never have foreseen.
This principle ensures that only reasonable, foreseeable harm is compensated, which keeps the law balanced.
Harini, can you explain me about the but-for test?
The but-for test asks, could the harm have occurred but for the defendant action? If the answer is no, then the defendant couldn't cause the harm.
So think of it as asking if the defendant had acted correctly, would the damage still have happened?
This is widely applied in Malaysian negligence caused a linked conduct to harm clearly in the logical.
Vaishnavi, why is foreseeability so important when considering remoteness of damage?
So the remoteness limit liability to harms that were reasonably foreseeable. A famous example is the Wagon Mound, where the type of harm had to be predictable.
Only the general type of harm needs to be foreseeable, not the exact sequences of events.
For instance, spilling oil and make it possible that someone may slip even if you could not predict every consequences.
Tarifa, how do Malaysian courts apply these principles?
Court used but-for tests and foreseeability in the cases like road accident, medical, negligence, and property damage to ensure that the liability is logical connected to the harm that is being caused.
So, for example, in medical negligence, would the harm have occurred if the proper treatment had been given?
In accident cases, was the type of harm reasonably predictable given the circumstances?
Vaishnavi, how do causation and remoteness prevent unfair liability?
So, they prevent defendants from being held responsible for every possible consequences of their actions.
Only harm is that directly linked to the breach of the escape of a dangerous thing which is very compensated.
This ensures the law is fair, balanced, and predictable for both plaintiff and defendants.
Strict liability addresses the risk of posed by dangerous thing, ensuring that those who take risks are held accountable.
Negligence focuses on careless behavior, while strict liability focuses on inherently hazardous activities.
So, causation and foreseeability ensures that liability remains reasonable, preventing unfair punishment.
So, as a final closing, thank you for joining us to the Legal Lens.